All right, today we are heading back to the year 1994. It was an amazing year at the box office, ex-hardcore gamer. Actually, that was the year I saw my first ever R movie, which was The Crow. I believe that was 94. Anyways.
Can't rain all the time.
It was 1994. That was also, it wasn't my first R movie, but it was the first one I saw in theaters. But that's not the movie we're talking about today.
No, this is actually from director James Cameron, who just recently released, I guess maybe not that recent anymore, the newest in the Avatar franchise.
Yes. So in 1994, on July 15th, he released True Lies, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, Jamie Lee Curtis, Tom Arnold, and a James Cameron regular, Bill Paxton.
So the interesting thing about this James Cameron film in particular is that it's quite different from his other works. At least I think so.
I definitely see what you're saying. It definitely has more of that humor element to it that isn't in his movies as much. His other movies do have humor, but this one really added a lot of it. This is really like the beginning of overblown James Cameron. This was like a 2.5-hour movie. It was one of the first movies to come out with a $100 million budget. It was actually over $100 million.
Yeah, wow.
But it was the first one to cross that line. But it was fine because in the end, they still ended up making $378 million at the box office. So I think they're doing all right.
Pretty good take at the box office, I'd say. This director is also known for movies like Terminator, Aliens, The Abyss, Titanic, of course.
Never heard of it.
The first movie I ever saw a pair of boobs in. Titanic, just saying.
Okay, well then.
So yeah, when I think about those movies and then I watched True Lies last year, it just seemed so much different in comparison. It almost has like a buddy cop feel to it.
Oh, 100%, because you have Tom Arnold doing the more of the comedic stuff with Arnold.
I just realized it's Arnold and Arnold.
Yes, yes it is. That's right. Yeah, Arnold and Arnold. And apparently they became very good friends while making this movie.
Did they?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Tom Arnold at the time was about to be getting divorced from Roseanne Arnold, Roseanne Barr. And they were kind of having some like public issues. And they weren't really looked upon very well. And so when Cameron wanted to use Tom Arnold in the movie, the studio wanted to pull the funding.
Really? So they were hesitant to.
Yeah, they were saying you really need to cast somebody else. But James Cameron loved him so much. He's like, look, if you don't make it, I'm going to go to another studio and they're going to make it. And so they said, okay, never mind. And I think it worked out. I think he was great in the movie. And the plot itself, for those of you that don't know, Arnold plays a secret agent that's pretending to be a salesman for business software. So his wife thinks that he's a salesman that's just always going away on these business trips, when in reality, he's actually doing missions to save the world from terrorists.
Secret agent, man. Yes, so True Lies was successful at the box office, but I'm going to pick your brain now even more. Did the franchise go any further after the original release? So did we get a sequel? Did we get a TV series? Anything like that?
So they did try to get some sequels off the ground in the years since, but there would always be something that would hold it back. And then ultimately, like, because it had to deal with terrorism, after 9/11, it kind of made it difficult. Yeah. James Cameron was quoted as saying, like, terrorism just isn't funny anymore. So it made it difficult, and you didn't want to make it too stereotypical, I guess. So it kind of was put on ice for a while, but just recently, this past TV season, there was a TV show which lasted for the whole season, but unfortunately was ultimately canceled.
Did you happen to check it out?
I didn't.
No.
I wanted to watch it, and then it got canceled because everybody kind of like didn't like it. From what I hear, it didn't have that like trademark humor we were just talking about. It didn't have as much of that you would expect. It didn't have that chemistry.
Didn't have two Arnolds.
Didn't have two Arnolds. That's the trick. You need two Arnolds to make it work, and it didn't have that. But although it didn't have a sequel and it did have a failed TV show, it did have
a video game in 1995. Can't find the exact date, but it seems to be like maybe even late 94.
Yeah,
actually, like December-ish.
IGN did list it as December 31st, 1994, but every other source that I looked it up said 1995 just as the general year. So it didn't come out at the same time as the movie, but it did come out relatively within a certain window, which was kind of the case back then.
I was just going to say,
it wasn't always the launch day and date kind of thing.
I feel like we didn't always get those concrete launch dates like we do now. You know, there's a few that stick out to me, like the Mortal Monday, stuff like that.
Sure.
But for the most part, you would often just walk into a store and be like, oh, A True Lies game. I had no idea.
Here we
this
go.
was coming out. But yeah, it did in fact come out, and this was one that I rented, so I was familiar with the game a little bit. Now going back to it now is crazy, and a lot of memories were kind of seeping in again. But I really enjoyed this game back then, and I still enjoyed it quite a bit now, to my surprise.
Yeah. So
as you know, sorry not to interrupt.
No.
These movie tie-ins weren't always the greatest.
No, they definitely weren't. And this was definitely for a little inside baseball here. This was your idea to be able to do this one. I knew that I wanted the idea of trying to just look at some video game tie-ins to movies, but you were the one that specifically stated we should do True Lies. I never played it back then, so this was my first time actually experienced playing it, and I really got worried because it was published by none other than Acclaim. If you play the Nintendo versions of the game, because it was released on Super Nintendo and Game Boy, those do have the LJN sub-label, but as we know now, that was just Acclaim in disguise back then, due to Nintendo's limits as to how many games you could publish per year.
So not always the mark of quality.
No, it scared me. It scared me. You were like, this game was good, and I was like...
And I had that same thought myself, but, you know, I went back and played it, and to my surprise, I was still enjoying the game. So a few of these good titles did, in fact, carry the LJN label.
Yeah, and I think what it comes down to is also just not only... Obviously, you have the publisher who ultimately decides what comes out, but really the ones who make the game, the developers, they're the ones that are going to make or break it. And in this case, it was Beam Software, kind of a decent developer that was a little surprising that Acclaim was working with them.
Australian, right?
Yes, they were from Australia and later became known as Chrome Studios, or at least Chrome Studios Melbourne, because Chrome Studios bought them. They made more licensed games all the way up, I think, until the 360 era. So, unfortunately, they no longer exist. They did shut down in 2010. So, yeah, that would be the 360 era. That's before the Xbox One and PS4.
Surprised they went that long, honestly.
They did.
Yeah.
They actually made Nightshade on the NES, if anybody remembers that. I never played it, but I do remember the cover. It was like this like kind of spy-looking guy. He's in the shadows with his big trench coat and hat, and... It was, if you saw it, I bet you would recognize it. But
yeah, but I do know that it served as the basis for what would be Shadowrun.
Yes, so if you were to go back and play Nightshade, again, I never played it, but I watched some videos online while doing research for this video. You can see it's kind of like the groundwork being laid for Shadowrun, which then ultimately leads to what this game is as well. If you do recognize the Beam Software name, not only did they do Shadowrun, Bad Street Brawler, which was a game that I had on both PC and NES as a kid.
Really?
Very weird. Little tangent note. On PC, you're beating up old women and gorillas. Old women that are swinging their purses at you, and punks, and yeah, it was a little bit too violent for Nintendo, so they changed it. So instead of the old woman swinging her purse, it was a punk who was swinging like a ball and chain, and you're fighting. You still fight the gorillas. Very weird. You have dogs biting at you. It was a weird brawler, obviously says the name. Weird brawler in the 80s that they made a little sanitized version for Nintendo, but that was Beam Software. They did Back to the Future for LJN, which we might talk about in the future.
In the future, yes, indeed.
Back to the Future.
But the most important game that they made was, of course, Family Feud.
Family, yes. I know that's one that you were a big fan of.
I love any of those game shows brought to video game form.
I actually read a fun little fact, totally unrelated to doing research on this. It was just me reading up on it. That Family Feud, you could enter in extra letters. As long as you had the letters it was looking for, it would say that you were right. So you could have this big, long, nonsensical sentence, but because it had the right letters, that was the way they programmed it. As long as it had the right letters in the right order, even if there were other letters in between, it would tell you that you got it right. So it was this weird, like a series of images of all these like nonsense sentences that gave you the right answer. But like I said, I was worried at first, and in the end, this actually ended up coming out quite well. Came out on Super Nintendo, the Genesis, or the Mega Drive if you're in Europe, and well, everywhere but the US.
Yes.
And Game Boy and Game Gear. So the Terminator 2 game was such a success for Acclaim that they immediately signed a deal where they were like, we want whatever Arnold does next.
Are we talking the Terminator 2 arcade game?
So it was both. They
Okay.
did an arcade game port, and they did their own like
The one we see everywhere with the cool
side-scroller.
guns.
Yeah.
I love that one.
So they made both of those. So you had one movie that spawned 2 different games.
That was a big movie. So.
And it was on multiple platforms. So Acclaim was like, this is just a license to print money. So they're like, whatever Arnold does next, we want to do it. And so True Lies is what came next. And unfortunately, since as we talk about, it's not a total straightforward action movie. There's a lot of plot. It's not just him saving the world, but also he thinks that his wife is having an affair and he's trying to save his marriage. And obviously they were like, when they watched the movie, the publisher, they were like, how are we going to make a game out of this? Where's the game? Like, we got all this stuff about
bit of a drama,
infidelity.
yeah.
And it goes on for, like, it's a 2.5-hour movie, so there's a lot to it. And they were really worried they weren't going to be able to do it. The developers didn't even get an advanced screening. They just got the script. And they also were like, where's the game? But in the end, they actually were able to do it. They were like, you know what? We're going to take some of the locations from the movie, whether it's an explicit, you know, actual action scene from the movie, or maybe just something that they happen to pass by. At least it's inspired by the movie. And they're able to do different locations from that movie and created a nice overhead run and gun shooter.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing, was it? Unfortunately, it sounds like the development process was a little bit messy at times.
Yeah, so they basically were trying to figure out what was going to work and what wasn't going to work. And in trying out different things, they would add a new feature and it would end up breaking something. One of the things that's a perfect example is there's a dodge move. There's like a little like defensive roll you can do. And once they added that, they found out, well, now you can just roll through the whole game. You're just
breaking
it's too good of a dodge, and you can just roll through and just cruise right through the game. So they were like, well, what can we do to fix that? And they put landmines on the ground. There's not really landmines in the movie, but they were like, we need to do something for the sake of making a video game to make it so that it's not so game breaking that you can just roll through the whole thing. And so little things like that kind of just kept coming up. And then there were also problems like the developers, they were Australian, they're trying to have some fun and doing some humorous takes. Like there's a scene that takes place in a mall. And so they came up with these fake mall store names. And they constantly were getting notes back from Acclaim saying, take this out, change this. I don't get it. This doesn't make sense.
Nothing like the movie, right?
No, because they didn't have a ton to work with because they're making it in tandem to like the movie is also really quickly in the mall. It's not like they're focusing on what stores are and aren't there.
You wonder sometimes they even have access to the movie when they're making these games.
So they did a screening for Acclaim, but not for Beam Software. So the publisher had access to it. The developer didn't.
And kind of backwards.
Yeah, I know. They had the script, but yeah, so the humor kept getting lost on them, and there actually is a store in the mall in the game called Humor Gap. Because I felt like there was a big gap in the humor between Acclaim and Beam Software. So, yeah, it wasn't all smooth sailing when they were trying to make the game. But in the end, you end up getting a game that was still... I mean, we've mentioned it before. It's no secret. I think it's quite fun.
Yeah, it's a good little top-down gun game. You have 9 levels to go through. You mentioned the mall there. You also go through Chinatown at one point, an oil refinery.
Because in the movie, the wife has like a secret lunch with a guy in one scene. They're like, well, Chinatown is in the movie, so we're going to do Chinatown in the game. Even though it wasn't an action scene, they're like, we're going to do Chinatown.
And another cool thing is, of course, like many retro games, there was a password system. So there was no actual native saving like there is today. It's so easy. You did have to enter passwords to pick up from levels that you left off from.
Which is good because there are 9 levels and it does take quite some time to get through the game. It's not your usual retro game that you can... I mean, you could sit down and play it in one sitting. We definitely did, but it takes some time. It's a little bit of a slog. I remember I made a comment while we were playing it, and you said to make sure to include it. So this is that part right now, where I said, just like the movie, it goes on a little bit too long in some segments, that it isn't quite as tight as it could be. I think they could have lessened some of the levels, especially that dock level. There's a level in the dock where you have to find all those
yeah,
items.
a lot of wandering, and it just kind of drags out.
I give them credit for trying to add some variety to the gameplay. It's not just run and gun. You're now trying to find some bombs to defuse and stuff, but it's just too much wandering. It's too easy to miss some things, and it took too long.
For the most part, it's a pretty straightforward top-down shooter. Not hard to play. The controls are very simple. You mentioned that roll, which is kind of effective, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't always use it. I feel like that, and there's a strafe function that it's there. It's not necessarily super important, but it is something that you can use. And the game is difficult, so maybe if we got better at using those different techniques, that we could have done a little bit better before resorting to some cheating.
Yes.
Whoopsie. Yeah. So yeah, the passwords not only let you start at what level you want to start at, but there's also some fun little cheats, including one that I discovered very last minute that I just showed you before we started recording.
Yes, the Jason password, basically.
I don't know if it's necessarily
more like
Jason.
more like a Splatterhouse, maybe?
I mean, he puts on a mask. It's not a hockey mask. I don't even know what it is. It almost looks like a paper bag with like a smiley face drawn on it. But he uses a chainsaw, and you can just run through the whole game. Just like, you're not invincible, but you're super fast, and you can chainsaw everybody, including the innocent people.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. That was very late game that you showed me that. When we initially played these games, I had no idea that password existed.
I kind of just wanted to do one little last-minute run-through on some research to see if there was any little tidbit that would be worth mentioning, and I'm glad I did, because oh man, I was laughing so hard when I first saw that.
I guess there's a flamethrower too. We didn't uncover that in our time with
there's like little secret areas in most levels that you can find extra ammo, and the flamethrower, as long as you're playing the actual like home consoles, the flamethrower is not in the handheld versions, but it is in the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions. And it's just kind of funny that like there's this super powerful weapon that we never found and never got to use, but it's because they knew it was so powerful, they made it kind of hidden to get to. Almost like, fighting the BFG in Doom. Like, you gotta work for it. We're not gonna just give it to you.
Speaking of versions, though, of course, this was the time of censorship with Nintendo, where they weren't big on having bloody, violent games on the Super. But True Lies, to our surprise, is rather bloody, even in that version.
Yeah, I think this is post Mortal Kombat 2 when Nintendo finally we have the ESRB. And that is the rating system that we still have to this day. So now that the ESRB is in place, we can start putting ratings on games, and Nintendo is letting more things slide that they didn't let in previous games. So when we played the Genesis game first and we see the blood as you're shooting guys and, they die in the pool of blood, I was like, oh, Super Nintendo's not going to have this. And then you play Super Nintendo, you're like, oh, I guess you are going to let us do that. So it was post that little censorship era, which is, it wouldn't have been game breaking. I think the game still would have been fun. You don't need the blood, but it was nice that we didn't have to worry about saying when we were comparing versions that, oh, Super Nintendo is the squeaky clean version. It was every bit the same in terms of content.
Yeah, I would say in general, these versions are all pretty much in line with one another. The Super Nintendo does have the slightly better colors and graphics like you would expect.
The usual.
The soundtrack is debatable. It really kind of depends on what your preference is. I like the Sega Genesis sound chip a lot, so I kind of lean towards that myself.
I do too. Growing up as a Sega kid, that was what I always prefer. But with that being said, it's not that the Super Nintendo one is bad. It's a different style. It's like, a little bit clearer with the instrumentation of what you're hearing. Mm-hmm. So you're gonna have, it's a different sound, so it's a preference. I think they're both great.
Yeah, no, they are both great. The version that I would probably recommend avoiding if you had to avoid one would be the Game Gear. Just because it was a little rough around the edges.
I'm having PTSD, little flashbacks right now to that. I forgot about that until you just mentioned it.
Yeah, I know I did say they're all kind of the same, but if you had to avoid one, not that it's completely terrible, but it's definitely not quite as good as the Game Boy or the other versions, obviously.
Shockingly, usually the Game Gear version was better. I remember, again, being a Sega kid, I had a Game Gear, so like playing Mortal Kombat 2 on Game Gear was great. It was so much better than playing it on the Game Boy. It just had better graphics. It obviously had color, more detail to it, and usually the sound would be better too, although the Game Boy would still kind of have its own charm too when it came to sound. But yeah, the Game Gear, there was like slowdown in the Game Gear version that wasn't in the Game Boy version. The graphics look like it's the same exact thing as the Game Boy. They just, honestly, it looks like when they just decided to add color to the pixels.
Yeah,
it was like all the same
seems
art.
like a real quick, dirty port of the Game Boy version.
Sound, oh my god, that music is grating. It's very repetitive. oof is all I can say on that Game Gear music. But yeah, the Game Gear and Game Boy are both pretty similar to each other. They don't have all the levels that are in the Super Nintendo and Genesis. And it doesn't have the dive roll because you don't have as many buttons to work with.
That's right, too.
But the Game Boy, you can pause it.
Yeah.
And you can't on the Game Gear because there's one less button on the system itself.
And let's be honest, if you're going to go back and play this game, it's probably less likely you have the Game Gear version on mind anyways. So.
Yeah. It's very hard. Like, when you're going back and playing retro games, you're not typically doing handheld versions. We did it because we're crazy people. So you have shoot, strafe, and cycling through your weapons, which on Super Nintendo is easy. You use L and R to be able to cycle through, and there's the A button also will just kind of go through it. Genesis, it's a little bit different. If you have the 3-button controller, A is the lock on, and if you double tap it, you'll roll. B is shoot, and C is change weapons. If you have the 6-button controller, then A is strafe, B is shoot, C is dive roll, and then X and Z are your like L and R on Super Nintendo to scroll through. So it's pretty simple to play. I thought it was a nice layout. The controls make sense. You know, it's a little bit of a change when you're going from one platform to the other. The layout's a little bit different, but
not much.
Whatever version you play, you will quickly get used to it, and it's a lot of fun. You know, you're sneaking around and well, not sneaking. It's definitely very much just going around and killing people. I feel like that they could have maybe added a little bit of some stealth elements since that was a part of the movie.
Maybe a knife to the throat or something like that.
Yeah, but they definitely didn't have that. But yeah, it's you're picking up shotguns and grenades and dropping mines and doing all kinds of like cool things that you would find in any action game that if it was called anything else, I think people might have actually been more likely to play it than it being tied to a movie where people kind of got scared like, oh, it's a movie tie-in. So it might not be good, but...
And you are getting the real actors, or at least depictions of those real actors. When you have those cutscenes, though, those are pretty rough on the eyes. Well, if you want to call them cutscenes.
Yeah.
Still images.
What we know as cutscenes now, they're still images, but they are like digitized stills from the movie. So it's not like in-game graphics. It's definitely like a still frame from the movie.
Yeah, that was another thing with the handheld versions. You couldn't really make those pictures out quite as well. I believe it was the Super Nintendo had the clearest images, if I recall.
They're a little bit clearer just because you have more colors available to use, but they're still very blocky and low resolution, so it's not great, but it is kind of cool, like something that ties it to the movie that other games don't always have. Like if it were on a CD-based system, it would have been, you know, full motion video clips or a more clearer image that would have still been grainy because that's the way they were back then, but it felt like more effort went into it. Some movie games that I'm sure we're going to talk about in the future really just feel like they just kind of slapped a license on some other random game that had nothing to do with it. This one, you could tell they were trying their best to make it fit for a movie that they felt they could make no game and almost didn't even make it. They almost were like, you know what? We need to drop the license because there's no way we can make a game for this.
In the end, Hardcore Gamer, how faithful to the movie is the video game, did you feel like?
I think it's very faithful because not only do you have those digitized stills that we talked about that are taken straight from the movie, the locations are all something that are from it as well. Even if it wasn't an action scene in the movie, at least it was a location that you saw at some point. So they try to recreate things that you would have seen. You know, the ending's a little bit different and they took out the stuff with the wife, but how would you make that a video game? Like, it's stuff that makes sense to change. And so it's really just makes it more of just the spy aspect of the movie, which that's what's going to be fun. And that's what you want in a video game. So, you know, you have like the running in the snow and then snowmobiles chasing you. You have when the guy was on the motorcycle chasing, you know, you're not riding the horse like you were in the movie, but it's still that particular scene from the movie. It tries really hard for what they were given.
It was obvious they didn't have everything to work with, you know.
But you have locations. You have a fun game that has the spy aspect. You have like the logo showing up of your agency. It's the Omega, which, side note, they have Charlton Heston in it, who is the Omega Man. And he looks very Nick Fury. He's got his eye patch. I'm sure that's not a coincidence. The music feels like something that was good for a video game. Like, it's not necessarily the music from the movie, but like it fit. Like, honestly, in the end, it felt like the movie. It ties in well and it's fun, and that's really all I can ask for.
So at the end of the day, yeah, fun movie. and a fun game. Share your thoughts down below. Did you see True Lies when it launched in theaters all the way back? Did you somehow have the video game, whether it was on Super Nintendo, Genesis, Game Gear, or Game Boy? We'd love to hear your memories of the movie and the game. But for now, Hardcore Gamer, we're going to get out of here until the next movie video game tie-in.
Sounds great.
Keep it locked to I Dream of Retro for more great content. Patreon.com/I Dream of Indie Games if you want to support us further that way. This is our sister channel that's all about retro games. We have movie tie-ins like this, but we also have some retro reviews going on. And some
kind of in-depth history of various aspects of video games. We have a video out now that has to deal with the history of Mickey Mouse starring video games.
Yes, we're going through every single Mickey Mouse game up to the GameCube era, so we're busy for sure. And we're going to keep you all hopefully entertained and enjoying all the great content. So
thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.